Moving along with the second part of this lecture, little is actually known about the origins of the ocean, when the oceans first appeared. We do know the Earth is 4.55 billion years old, and we also know that the water in the oceans originated from either volcanic degassing of water from the deep interior of the Earth, that water having accumulated there from all of the dust and material that had accumulated into the Earth during its accretion, or alternatively, it was brought in by late surface bombardment of the Earth by planetesimals that had derived from the outer asteroid belt. And we know that has to be the origin of the water due to the isotopic composition of the water. What else do we know? We also know that the oceans could not have formed from the atmosphere before Earth's surface had cooled sufficiently to condense water. You might think that would be at 100 degrees C, so after the atmosphere had cooled to less than 100 degrees, but because Earth's early atmosphere was very CO2 rich and extremely dense, the boiling point of water was probably up around 230 degrees and not 100 degrees as it is at lower pressure. Some of the earliest geological evidence, in fact the earliest geological evidence of water on Earth, is the occurrence of pillow basalts in Greenland. These particular pillow basalts, which you know erupted underwater because they have these chilled, rapidly cooled margins on them. Obviously they needed to be erupted into water, and that was thought to be the ocean. Moving along and thinking about the ocean, if you're like me, it wasn't really until I started studying the oceans in detail that I really thought about the oceans being any different from a giant tub of seawater. It turns out that the oceans are actually really quite complicated and structured. So the simplest way to think of the ocean is to divide it into two parts, into the surface ocean and the deep ocean. And so the surface ocean is more or less the upper 100 metres of the ocean. And it's distinct from the deep ocean because of two main things. One is that light only penetrates down to about 100 metres depth. It depends on the wavelength somewhat. Red light doesn't penetrate as far as blue and green light, but there's only sufficient blue and green light getting down to about 100 metres to allow phytoplankton to grow. The other defining characteristic of the surface ocean is that winds across the surface, which produce waves and turbulence, produce a mixed layer through that turbulence that is about 100 metres thick. So that's what distinguishes the surface ocean from the deep ocean, which is dark, obviously where plants don't grow, and it's not mixed by these turbulent processes that happen in the upper part of the ocean. One of the next things I might just run the class through is how do we observe and measure the ocean? Well, until fairly recently, we actually didn't know that much about the ocean because we really didn't have the capacity to make measurements deep below the surface. One of the main ways that oceanographers and marine scientists have been measuring the ocean for the last 70 or 80 years is using scientific research vessels like this one shown here. And one of the sampling methods for sampling water from deep in the ocean is to cast one of these CTD rosettes over the side of the ship. So if you look closely at this, you might just be able to make out these long plastic bottles. Each one of these, in this case, probably holds either 10 or 20 litres of water, and they have a cap on their top and bottom ends, and those caps are left open. So they lower this over the side of the ship on a steel wire, and they lower that down to perhaps 5 or 6 kilometres depth. And as they're bringing it back towards the surface, they're measuring the conductivity, which gives the salinity, the temperature, and also the pressure, which gives the depth. And they trigger these caps to close so that you collect a water sample at a known particular depth. And so as they're bringing this up, a rosette like this one shown here would have 24 bottles on it, so they'd be able to take 24 water samples at different depths as they bring the rosette back to the surface. And it wasn't until the 1980s or so that there was a major international experiment conducted where most of the major scientific countries around the world invested in a large international project where they drove ships along each one of these lines that you see on the map here, and they would stop every degree or so, which is about 100 kilometres, and they would make one of these CTD casts and collect water samples, then bring them back to the laboratory and measure it. And you can see this is quite an experiment in terms of the number of lines that were surveyed across the ocean. It's an ongoing experiment. It's been running now for about 40 years. So another method measuring the ocean is either to deploy sensors out in the ocean, like the Tau Triton Array, which is a series of sensors set out across the Pacific Ocean from east to west in this manner, and they're tied to the bottom through wires, keeps them in place. And then there are a number of sensors hanging on the wire, and the wire will have a float at the top. So they continuously measure things like the temperature, salinity of the water across this part of the ocean. And the reason why this array is here is because they're trying to measure the El Nino Southern Oscillation process as it evolves and decays continuously. Another method is, this one's a little bit more recent, is the deployment of these Argo drifting floats. So these floats essentially drift around the ocean. There are about almost 4,000 of these deployed around the ocean, and they just drift around on the ocean currents. And what the floats do is that periodically, every 10 days or so, they take on water, so they become negatively buoyant and they sink into the ocean, and they go down to about 2,000 meters and then drift along, and then they come up again back to the surface. And all the while they're doing that, they're sampling the temperature and salinity profiles in the ocean. So they just continually move around the ocean, measuring these profiles. Every time they come back to the surface, what they do is they transmit their information back to a satellite and it's recorded. So this is a much cheaper way of measuring what's going on in the ocean in very remote parts of the ocean, rather than having to take ships out into the ocean. The average cost of running a ship like the one shown here would be roughly $100,000 a day. These ships only go about 200 kilometres a day, so it's a very slow process getting ships around the ocean and doing ocean experiments. These sorts of new automated ways of sensing and analysing the ocean have made a big difference to oceanography and our understanding of the ocean. The last method of observing and making measurements in the ocean is satellites. And so this is a rapidly evolving area of innovation. And the number of satellites and what they're measuring is growing all the time. And so we now have satellites that measure sea surface temperature, sea surface salinity, wave height, wind speed, current speeds, ocean surface height. I'll be showing you some of that data a little bit later this week. The amount of chlorophyll, which is the amount of plant growth or phytoplankton in the ocean. And they also measure things like the gravity field of the entire ocean. So there's a lot of information coming in that's integrated together and analysed and turned into very specific information about a whole range of properties of the ocean that oceanographers pretty much use all the time now. The only shortcoming of this type of measurement is that these techniques really only see or look at the surface ocean. They can't really look into the deep ocean. So to do those deep ocean measurements, we still need sensors and conventional shipboard sampling and deployments. Just on the right here, this just shows the sea WIFs, ocean colour image. So this actually shows where phytoplankton, or it's measuring concentration of chlorophyll in the ocean. Chlorophyll shows up as the bright green areas, and the areas that are low in chlorophyll are these blue areas. We'll talk a little bit more about those gyres and why they don't have very much chlorophyll or phytoplankton growth in them a little later on.